What is something most people don't know about the Bible? There is a good story about a guy named Abimelech who had a rock dropped on his head by a woman. As he was dying, he begged his servant to run him through with his own sword, just so people would say that he wasn't killed by a girl. Judges 9:52-54. It actually says you aren't really doing charity if you publicize your charitable acts at all. But when you do merciful deeds, don't let your left hand know what your right hand does. It means you should try to keep your good deeds secret, to avoid the temptation of doing them for self-gain, and ensure pure intent. I tend to see a lot of Bible verses coming from extremist Christians quoting things/types of people God hates. But I strangely never see this one. Proverbs 6:16-19. There are 6 things the Lord hates, 7 that are detestable to him: haughty eyes, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked schemes, feet that are quick to rush into evil, a false witness who pours out lies, and a person who stirs up conflict in the community. The 10 plagues in Exodus are all attacks on Egyptian gods. For example, turning the Nile to blood. The Nile was a god to the Egyptians, and then turning it to blood was imagery of killing said god. Frogs were also considered gods, and when frogs were going flipping everywhere, plague 6 or something, Egyptians would be horrified to step on one of their gods. Similar to the Nile, when God cast darkness upon Egypt, it was like killing the sun, Egyptian god Ra. So it was really big that God asked the Jews to slaughter a lamb at the first Passover. The lamb was an Egyptian god. God said, kill this animal that Egyptians consider a god, and paint your doorposts with its blood, and everyone knew that the penalty would be death. So God was basically telling them to risk their lives to trust that he would deliver them. Moses and the Jewish people didn't wander through the desert lost for 40 years right after they escaped Egypt. They made it to the promised land in a normal amount of time for walking, but were met with armies of the already settled. Nearly every person demanded to go back to Egypt to live as slaves rather than face certain death in the promised land. God said none of the currently living Jews would get to enjoy the promised land. So Moses led them around the desert for 40 years until all the haters had died. The term Bible comes from the Greek biblio, which literally just means book. The story of Ehud and Eglon. So, there was a wild and woolly period before Israel had kings that is covered in the book of Judges. Most of these are just legends, but one in particular is hilarious and badass. There was a judge named Ehud, and Israel was ruled over by a kingdom ruled by a guy named Eglon. So, Ehud goes to meet Eglon, and I'll let the Bible tell it. 16 Now Ehud had made a double-edged sword about a cubit d long, which he strapped to his right thigh under his clothing. 17 He presented the tribute to Eglon, king of Moab, who was a very fat man. 18 After Ehud had presented the tribute, he sent on their way those who had carried it. 19 But on reaching the stone images near Gilgal, he himself went back to Eglon and said, Your Majesty, I have a secret message for you, greater than sign. The king said to his attendants, Leave us. And they all left, greater than sign. 20 Ehud then approached him while he was sitting alone in the upper room of his palace, and said, I have a message from God for you. As the king rose from his seat, 21 Ehud reached with his left hand, drew the sword from his right thigh, and plunged it into the king's belly. 22 Even the handle sank in after the blade, and his bowels discharged. Ehud did not pull the sword out, and the fat closed in over it. 23 Then Ehud went out to the porch. He shut the doors of the upper room behind him and locked them. That's some Batman level crap right there. Despite what many Christians and much of pop culture believe, Mary Magdalene was not a prostitute. She's just often mixed up with an unnamed female sinner who also washed Jesus' feet with her hair. Edit with some biblical sources. Basically, Mary Magdalene is often confused with, or possibly the same as, Mary of Bethany, who did wash Jesus with her hair. Mary of Bethany is further confused with a woman who was a sinner, often thought to be a prostitute, although it doesn't say that, who also washed Jesus' feet with her hair. Anointing at Bethany, Matthew 26.6.13 and Mark 14.3.9, mentions just a woman who uses costly ointment to anoint Jesus' head at the house of Simon the leper. Sinful woman Luke 7.36.50 tells of a woman in the city who was a sinner who went to Jesus at the Pharisee's house and stood behind him at his feet, weeping, and began to bathe his feet with her tears and to dry them with her hair. Though she is just called a sinner, she is often assumed in churches and popular culture to be a prostitute. Mary Magdalene is mentioned many times in many contexts, but an important passage is directly following the sinful woman passage in Luke 8.1.3, where she is mentioned as one of several women who accompany Jesus and the disciples. It says Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out. Presumably this close proximity in mentions contributes to the confusion. Jesus visits Mary and Martha. Luke 10.38.42 mentions Martha and her sister Mary, who I assumed was and was taught in church/Sunday school was Mary Magdalene. Though this might be wrong, there's a lot of Marys in the Bible. The Mary in this story is the sister of Martha and Lazarus. Mary of Bethany. Mary sits at Jesus' feet and listens to him. The death of Lazarus, John 11.1.44, and again in John 12.1.8, Lazarus of Bethany, brother to Mary and Martha, falls ill. Mary and Martha send to Jesus for help, but before he gets there, Lazarus dies. Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. In both John 11 and John 12, Mary of Bethany is mentioned to have washed Jesus' feet with costly perfume and her hair. This is the story where Judas complains about the cost of the perfume. The ark had more than 2 of each animal. Genesis 7:2-3. 2 of every clean beast thou shalt take to thee by 7s. The male and his female, and of beasts that are not clean by 2, the male and his female. 3 of fowls also of the air by 7s, the male and the female, to keep seed alive upon the face of all the earth. People just like the 2-biter story. Noah ate beef on the ark. Jesus once cursed a fig tree. The story of Jonah and the whale is often used as a fable for children. The story told goes as follows. God tells Jonah to preach to the heathen city of Nineveh. Jonah doesn't do it, gets swallowed by a whale, and then goes to Nineveh and everyone converts to fearing God. However, the real story of Jonah and the whale shows absolutely no character growth in Jonah, and would be a horrible children's story. Jonah wasn't afraid to go to Nineveh because of the people there, as the story most Baptist children are told goes. He's afraid to go because he cannot stomach that God would forgive the infamously pagan city. He tries to escape God by sailing by boat, when God sends a massive storm causing the other sailors to panic. Jonah eventually confesses he is a reason for the storm and tells the sailors to throw him overboard, which he decides in the best course of action as opposed to simply repenting to God. This shows that Jonah would rather die than go preach in Nineveh. But when he is thrown into the sea he is swallowed and later vomited up by a whale that God sent. When Jonah eventually goes to Nineveh he gives a stupid short sermon basically only saying you will all die in like 40 days or whatever. He never even mentions God in the entire sermon. God makes it so that the sermon causes the entire city to repent. The story ends with Jonah begging God to kill him so he doesn't have to bear the knowledge that he saved Nineveh. Cain and Abel had a brother named Seth, and no one cares about him. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God. Quite funny when you consider all the ultra-rich Christians. In 2 Kings 23, there is a story where God sends bears to kill 42 children because they were making fun of a man's baldness. Not all the Pharisees opposed or hated Jesus. The ones mentioned in the NT that were portrayed as hypocritical and trying to trick Jesus were likely an in-group within the Pharisee group. And I think Paul remained a Pharisee even after his conversion. Some Pharisees even defended Jesus. There's an entire book of erotic poetry in there. Also, God can't defeat iron chariots. The only breed of dog named in the Bible is the greyhound. I went to a Christian university where Bible classes were mandated. I actually really liked learning a lot about the Bible, though there were some iffy things about it. My first year, I took a New Testament course, and we went through it book by book. Whenever the subject of authorship came up, my professor, an adjunct, would say, "Who wrote it?" Well, it says it was written by Paul, so therefore, it was written by Paul. My next year, during a theology course with a much more scholarly professor, We were going over 1 Timothy, and I mentioned that it was odd that Paul specifically says Eve was the first sinner in that, when he was very clear about sin coming through Adam in Romans. Then my professor just casually said, "Oh, that's why many people don't think Paul wrote Timothy," and then just moved on with the lesson, like he hadn't just blew my mind. The influence of other ancient cultures is strong in the art. The stories of Genesis have parallels between Enuma Elish and the story of Gilgamesh, but that is covered frequently. On Exodus though, the text has an Egyptian style to it. A habit of Egyptian records is that they never write the names of their enemies, only refer to them as country or the king of country, and they never record defeat. Instead they only ever write about how they overwhelmingly destroyed their enemies. Exodus uses both. Pharaoh has no name, and essentially God demolishes Egypt with excessive force. Not only that, but there is a Egyptian tale that used to be written on the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a billboard which told the story of a king who was enemies with Egypt. He kept backstabbing the pharaoh, and as a result Egypt wreaked havoc in his lands, causing his people misery. Eventually the king gave in, and then a long peace followed for both countries. Exodus also mimics that story, God plaguing the Egyptians until the pharaoh gave in by dying, causing peace for both people. Also case laws, if you do X then you must repay by doing Y, were popular in Mesopotamia, but commands, you shall not do X, Y is not specified, because you will not freaking do X, unless you are stupid/suicidal, were more of an Egyptian thing, and was not seen in Mesopotamia, until we see Israel develop, which used both types of laws. Deuteronomy was actually the first book of the Torah, but it got lost. Someone eventually found Deuteronomy after these other books were written, which is why it tends to be placed after the others. Time to make some popcorn and sort by controversial. The Bible doesn't say that money is the root of evil. It says the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Seems like an idiot thing, but the majority of people doesn't know that the Big Bang Theory and the evolution doesn't disprove the Bible. The Bible never says a thing about the creation of the universe are fake, only about the earth. In the story of the prodigal son, nobody realizes how significant it is that not only did the father take the son back, but he ran out to greet him upon his return. In that culture, grown men were never seen running. It was an embarrassment for a grown man to run to the utmost extreme. The fact that the father not only took the son back, but ran out to him is supposed to illustrate how much God loves us, just like that father loved his son so much he didn't even care about being seen doing something considered horribly bad. You know the phrase an eye for an eye. Many say that if we all abide by an eye for an eye, then we all end up blind. I wish I could find the source, but I remember reading that the intent of that phrase in the Bible was not what modern interpretation would lead you to believe. So, what else can an eye for an eye mean? It really means no more than an eye for an eye. That is precisely an eye for an eye. Don't go beyond that. So if your neighbor accidentally kills your goat, you don't go and slaughter his family. Don't go overboard in the response. Your response should be measured and no more than the offense. The story of Noah and the flood is an almost verbatim copy of the story of the flood in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and I wouldn't be shocked if the story of the Tower of Babel wasn't also borrowed. It has the same departure from the narrative quality to it. My favorite has to be within Genesis 6:4. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. I'm also a huge Diablo fan, so that's partly why I find this part so interesting, and it certainly wasn't mentioned very often within the churches I attended. Who Jesus really was. People have this image of a judgmental prude, mostly because a lot of churches prefer him that way, but really, God was like a carpenter, a few fishermen, a tax collector, and a prostitute. Go save the world. Jesus is basically the Og counterculture. There's a dude named Samson who is like Bible Rambo and Achilles all in one. He talks about killing 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey because he was at war with them. He fell in love with a woman of the warring tribe, I think, and then he tells her that the reason he is super strong is because he hasn't had a haircut. So she cuts his hair as he sleeps, and he loses his power, only to be killed the next day. TL. Dr. Bible Rambo falls in love with the enemy, who betrays him by cutting his hair, and he dies. Crucifixion is said to be the worst pain imaginable. This is why we have the word excruciating, which derives from the Latin word crux or crucis. That Jesus drove a Honda, but it must have been an old model, as he didn't like it very much. In John 12:49 he clearly says, "For I did not speak of my own accord." Part 3. Go the extra mile, the third call of Jesus in the same passage. Today we use this saying in the same way we say give 110%. But it actually has a much different meaning. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the second mile is the actual verse. And the anyone that Jesus is referring to are Roman soldiers, who would often force the lower classes to carry their armor. As you can imagine, this sucked for the civilians. Roman law actually dictated that soldiers could force people to carry their armor for no more than 1 mile. If the Roman soldiers made people go over that 1 mile, severe punishments were handed out by commanding officers. Imagine the panic in a Roman soldier's eyes when he sees the civilian who is carrying his heavy armor continue walking after the 1 mile marker. If he wasn't already being beaten by his commanding officer, he would beg and plead, maybe force the civilian to give up their burden. The power dynamic switches automatically by going the extra mile. The civilian reasserts human dignity and takes back the power. Jesus is showing his followers how to protest and neutralize oppressive systems in these passages. TL. Dr. Jesus stands for, and with the oppressed. What we think we know about the Bible is totally changed when we read it through this lens. Guy on guy action is fine if you're a stoner. Leviticus chapter 20 verse 13. A man who layeth with another man shall be stoned. That Jesus gave his people 2 rules. 1. Love God before all things. 2. Love your neighbor as Jesus loved you. Basically Jesus said ignore every rule from the Old Testament and just remember these 2 things. This is all he wanted, yet most Christians can't even get that right. That the Bible lays out the concept of ignorance is bliss. For in much wisdom is much grief, and he that increaseth knowledge increaseth sorrow. Ecclesiastes 1:18. In chapter 1 verse 26 God tells a group of people. 26 Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness. Then God blesses the people with a few verses left in the chapter. You might get into a debate about his use of the word us, but that isn't what this is about. God made man and woman in chapter 1. In chapter 2 he made Adam. Cain was also afraid of the people who would see that he was marked by God, and took a wife of the people in a neighboring land. The common belief about Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel being the only 4 people in the world doesn't add up in the first few chapters. The serpent in the Garden of Eden story isn't Satan, it's just a talking serpent. The Satan interpretation was imposed much later by Christians. I would suggest reading about the history of your /Ellen Canaanite religion. The idea of the Bible being edited by later authors, based on different concepts of your /L makes the Bible far more interesting and cohesive. For instance, seeing God as the creator of the universe and all-powerful in one context, but changing his mind in Exodus, which probably never happened, based on the lack of archaeological evidence, and not being able to defeat a people with iron chariots. Additionally, scholars know that El was the king over the Canaanite pantheon and creator god, while Yor was more of a weather/war god. Now think about the overarching theme of Judges. When the Israelites were at peace, they went after different gods. You know, like the gods of fertility and prosperity, Baal and Asherah, instead of worshipping the war god Yor. So Yor gets jealous, and allows another nation to conquer them, so that people suddenly have to pray to him to deliver them. This thread has a lot of surprisingly productive and calm discussion. I haven't seen many arguments, and they mostly seem to actually come to conclusions instead of dissolving into personal insults. Nice job, Reddit. Out of all the books in the Bible, not one of them contains the word helicopter. It's a book of mythology, no different than the writings and legends of the Greeks, Romans, Norse before them. People don't go to heaven because they're a good person. This isn't really a Bible thing, but there's a peculiar and interesting detail about early depictions of Jesus that seems to be shied away from and ignored by modern Christians. In early art, and I mean like Roman period art, There have been discovered paintings and mosaics of Jesus performing his miracles with a wand or staff, but they are fairly similar. As someone who has always been annoyed with the idea that what God does isn't magic, but it's literally things happening magically, and that the church persecutes magic and its practitioners for nearly its whole existence, I have to laugh that early interpretations have him wielding a wand. I mean, even in the story of Moses, when he turns the staff into a snake, like, that seems like magic lol. There were giants that are half human, half angel called the Nephilim. It makes great rolling paper. Edit. Making this comment was worth the downvotes. Edit number 2. Ignore first edit. There used to be like 20 downvotes on this comment. There is quite a bit of secular history that backs up what the NT says about Jesus. Josephus, Tacitus, and Suetonius might not have that spelled right. Talk about a wise man called Jesus who had many followers, and the tribe of the Christians were named after Christus, who underwent the death penalty under Pilate, and that some claimed to see him after his death. Most of the extra biblical sources that talk about Jesus and the early Christians were themselves either Jewish, and thus against the Christians, or pagans who followed Roman religions, so they had no reason to be at all favorable to the new faith. But they mention Jesus anyway, because just how influential and well known he was. In the Talmud, Sanhedrin 43a, there is an arrest warrant for Jesus. Wanted, Jesus of Nazareth. He is to be stoned because he has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. If anyone has anything to say in his favor, let him bring it before the great Sanhedrin now. Everyone knows Jesus was crucified, but this arrest warrant was written in the future tense and never came to pass. But what it does make clear is that some crazy crap was happening around this guy. The full story of Lot and his family. Lots of people know the part about God sending angels to tell him to get out of town cause it's full of sinners and he's gonna burn that bitch down. Then his wife turns around to look and gets turned to salt for whatever reason. But people don't know that once in the mountains Lot's 2 daughters are like, oh crap, the world's over, let's get dad wasted and frick him. Our father is getting old, and there are no men in the whole world to marry us so that we can have children. Come on. Let's get our father wasted so that we can sleep with him and have children by him. Genesis 19:31-32. Yeah, so they did that and got pregnant, but turns out that not everyone was dead, just that one city. It pretty much contradicts itself throughout the whole thing and is almost entirely brutally violent and evil. The Bible makes the Texas Chainsaw Massacre look like a Smurf story. I was once Catholic. Read the Bible in my 20s, and then it was all over. No reasonable person can read it and still call it the good book. It is the exact opposite of that. Pure hate of everyone and everything. That is not a God-worshipping straight adult male. Absolutely deplorable. The vast majority of Christians worldwide don't read it, and aren't supposed to. Selected passages are read and interpreted en masse by priests/ministers who put them into context. When people ask me what would Jesus do, in an attempt to help me keep my temper in check, I calmly remind them of Matthew 21:12, where Jesus went into the temple and completely lost his crap, flipping tables, yelling, screaming, whole nine. That there is in the Old Testament a talking donkey who deliberately makes his owner look like a total idiot in front of an actual angel. Look up Balaam and his donkey in Numbers. It's quite a wild ride. Well, for Balaam anyway. That in Ezekiel 23:20 we have a description of some dudes who were packing serious heat. Literal super soakers. There she listed after her lovers, whose genitals were like those of donkeys, and whose emission was like that of horses. Niv. It calls for the death of non-believers as much or more than ancient Islamic texts. Leviticus, the part where it declares homosexuality a sin, is filled with stupid crap no K cares about. For real. Lime wearing clothes from mixed fabrics is a sin. It's gone through a lot of revisions and edits. Stories added. Stories removed. Not to mention language translations. The Bible we have today is vastly different than the original Bible that was written. I would love to see what the original Bible has in it. It's not a single book. It's dozens of books, letters, notes, poems, etc. that were collected over hundreds of years and compiled into a single book. It's not even universally agreed on which books should be in the Bible. Some Christian denominations have books in there that others don't. I'm honestly surprised. So many people seem to believe it was all written at once sometime after Jesus' ministry and left as the instruction manual for the church. There is a seriously strong passage in the New Testament about women needing to keep their heads covered as a symbol of man's authority over woman. Most modern preachers try to explain it away, but any idiot with a single brain cell would know what the passage means if they just read it. Source: I'm an ex-Christian. I covered my head for years and argued with a lot of people about what this passage really means. Called out a lot of people for being hypocritical about following the whole Bible including anti-gay texts, but not this passage, because this passage was personally inconvenient. Moses wasn't a Jew. The word used to mean day being Yom in Genesis, when God creates the universe. Can also mean period of time and a few other definitions that mean much longer than a day, meaning that an interpretation of Genesis 1 with this in mind would perfectly coincide with the believed age of the universe, and Earth as Yom could be referring to essentially eons for each portion of creation. It says that women shouldn't be able to teach or talk. That the Old Testament was never meant for Gentiles. People love to take the laws from the Old Testament and make fun of them, as if those are the laws today's Christians are trying to follow. If they are going to belittle or judge, I wish they would go by the current contract New Testament.